She had stopped screaming sometime in the night. That was the thing about real fear. It didn't stay loud. It went quiet in the end, pulled itself down into the chest, and crouched there, like something that had decided to wait instead of run. Nora Aldridge had been tied to that fence post since the previous evening, her wrists bound above her head with galvanized wire. Her jacket gone the cold coming off the canyon walls in slow, deliberate waves that had nothing personal against her. And that was almost the worst part of it. The Cimarron River murmured somewhere below in the dark, and the cottonwoods had gone bare and gold, and their leaves lay in drifts along the creek bank, and the sky overhead was the color of an old bruise fading toward gray. She was not screaming anymore. She was doing the harder thing, the quieter thing, staying conscious. If this story reaches something in you, if you feel the cold of that canyon in your own bones, please tap like and subscribe so you never miss the next ride. Pour your coffee, settle in, and tell me in the comments what time is it, where you are, and what city are you watching from, because your story matters just as much as hers. The horse found the trail before Eli Crane did. That was the way of it. Most mornings the animal had better instincts than the man better ears, a cleaner conscience and considerably less history to carry around. Eli was following a stray roan down the canyon floor east of Cimarron when the horse stopped and turned its head toward the dry creek bed to the left and held very still. The way horses held still when they smelled something that didn't belong to the landscape. Eli stopped too. He sat in the saddle and listened. Nothing. Wind off the Sangre de Cristos, a crow working the ridge above the soft knock of the roan's hooves on frozen clay when it shifted its weight. Then he heard it. Not a voice exactly, more like the sound of breathing that wasn't right, too controlled, too deliberate, the kind of breathing a person did when they had decided that breathing was going to be their whole occupation for the next little while, and they weren't going to spend any of it on anything else. Eli sat there for a moment longer than he should have. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had been telling himself things weren't his business for going on 4 years now, and he had gotten reasonably good at it, the way a man got good at anything he practiced daily. He could ride on. He probably should ride on. The roan was already drifting toward the creek bed with the quiet authority of an animal that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the human to catch up. Eli touched his heels to the horse's sides and went. She was maybe 30 feet back from the main trail, half hidden by a stand of dead brush tied to a fence post. That marked the boundary of somebody's winter grazing allotment. The wire at her wrists had been twisted tight with a pair of pliers, he could tell by the precise uniform coils, the same method a man used on fencing, and not much different from it. Her head was forward. Her brown hair had come loose from whatever she'd had it in and hung across her face. Her breathing was the sound he had heard from the trail, slow-counted, utterly controlled. He swung down from the saddle without speaking. She lifted her head at the sound of his boots on the frozen ground. Her eyes found him through the curtain of her hair, and something moved in them. Not relief, not yet something more guarded than that. The assessment of a woman who had learned not to assume rescue meant safety. "Ma'am," he kept his voice low and his hands visible, "I'm going to cut that wire." "Danny," her voice was rough, scraped thin by cold and hours of silence. "My nephew, he's at the house alone. He's been alone all night." Eli stopped. She read his face and pushed on her voice, gathering a little force from somewhere. "He doesn't know where I am. He's 9 years old and he doesn't know where I am. And he was alone all night in the cold, and I need you to go get him before you do anything else." Eli looked at her wrists. The wire had cut through her skin in 2 places where she'd pulled against it during the night. The skin around the wire was an ugly dark color in the early light. Her lips had gone pale. Her hands above the wire were the wrong color entirely. He made the calculation in about 2 seconds. "Where's the house?" "Edge of town, Cimarron, yellow door." She swallowed. "His name is Danny. He'll be on the front step. He always waits on the front step." "I'm not leaving you here." "Then be quick about it." He pulled his knife and went to work on the wire. It was thicker than rope and meaner. It didn't cut so much as yield slowly under sustained pressure. And the whole time he worked at it, she made no sound at all, which told him something about the kind of person she was. When the wire finally gave, she sagged forward, and he caught her with one arm around her shoulders, and she grabbed the front of his coat with both hands and held on for exactly 3 seconds before she straightened up and let go. "I'm all right," she said. He didn't argue with her. He unwrapped the bandana from his own neck and wound it around her wrists, tying it off gently. Then he stripped off his canvas work jacket and put it around her shoulders without asking. She pulled it closed around herself, and he saw her jaw unclench slightly when the warmth hit her. He helped her onto his horse. She was stiffer than she'd let on. Her legs didn't want to cooperate, and it took a moment longer than either of them pretended to notice. When she was settled, he swung up behind her, one arm coming around her waist to keep her steady, and turned the horse back toward the trail. "Hold on," he said. "I'm aware of the concept," she said. They rode hard. The house had a yellow door as advertised, and a small front step built of sandstone block. And on the step there was a boy. He was sitting very straight with a small, cloth-bound notebook in his lap and a short pencil behind his ear, and his dark eyes were fixed on the road coming into town with the absolute unblinking focus of someone who had decided that watching hard enough could make a thing happen. When Eli's horse came around the bend, the boy stood up, but he didn't run toward them, and he didn't call out. He just stood there and watched them come. Nora made a sound, small, involuntary, a sound that had no name, but that Eli felt somewhere behind his sternum. When they pulled up to the step, she half slid, half fell from the saddle, and Danny crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and put his arms around her middle and pressed his face against her ribs and held on. She put both bandaged hands on his head and held on back. Neither of them spoke. Eli sat on his horse and looked at the road. After a moment, the boy turned his face and looked up at Eli. His expression was calm in the way that wasn't actually calm, but was something older than that, a stillness that came from having already processed the worst possibility during the long hours of the night and come out the other side of it. "I knew she'd send someone," Danny said. Eli looked at him. He considered explaining that Nora hadn't sent him, that he'd simply been following a roan horse down a canyon floor, and his own animal had better judgment than he did. He decided against it. "Let's get her inside," he said instead. The house was small and cold and clean, the kind of clean that came from a person with a systematic mind and no patience for disorder. There was a cast iron stove in the front room, a kitchen table with 2 chairs and a smaller one that had been added later, a shelf of ledger books above the writing desk, and on the windowsill, a row of small river stones arranged by size. Eli built the fire while Danny helped Nora to the table and brought her a cup of water and stood beside her chair with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, the way a much older person might stand beside someone who needed steadying. Eli got the fire going and turned around. "You should go," Nora said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked at him. "I said, I heard you." He reached across the table and moved the kettle onto the hot part of the stove. "There's no water in this yet," he said to Danny. Danny looked at his aunt. She was quiet for a moment. Then she made a small motion with her head. Danny took the kettle to the water bucket by the door and filled it, and brought it back and set it on the stove with both hands. Then he sat down in his small chair and opened his notebook. Eli waited. Nora's hands were around the cup of water. She was looking at the table surface. Something was working behind her eyes, the arithmetic of deciding how much to say, how much to trust, whether trust was a commodity she could afford right now or a luxury she hadn't earned back yet. "You're not from here," she said finally. It wasn't really a question. "Passing through." Passing through from where to where? Hadn't decided the second part yet. She looked at him directly for the first time, brown eyes level and assessing the eyes of a person who worked with numbers and had learned that everything reduced to a question of what added up and what didn't. He could see her running the calculation on him, the worn coat, the good knife, the way he'd handled the wire on her wrists with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done precise, unpleasant work before. "What did you do before passing through?" she asked. "Pinkerton." Something moved in her expression. Not fear exactly, a recalibration. "Past tense," she said. 4 years passed." "Why did you leave?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the yellow door, and the fire in the stove ticked and settled. Danny's pencil moved in his notebook without any hurry. "I had evidence on a case," Eli said. "Evidence that would have cleared a man. My supervisor told me to lose it. I was told the agency's contract with the mining company that employed the man came first." He looked at the table. "I lost the evidence. The man was convicted. He died in the territorial prison 14 months later." He paused. I handed in my badge the week after I heard. The kettle began to steam. Danny got up, found 2 cups on the shelf, and set them on the table with the grave, deliberate movements of a boy performing an important task. He poured hot water into both cups and then went back to his notebook. Nora watched this. Then she looked at Eli. Harlan Voss, she said. You know that name? By reputation. Cimarron, land and cattle. Big enough to have a reputation 4 counties wide. I was his accountant and records administrator for 6 years. She turned the cup in her hands. Land records, transaction ledgers, survey filings. All of it passed through me before it went to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She set the cup down. 3 weeks ago, I was auditing the filed survey records against our internal ledger standard year-end reconciliation. I found a name on 6 different survey documents, a surveyor. Certified, signature, notarized, seal everything in proper order. She paused. His name was Walter Prine. He was the most credentialed land surveyor in the territory in the 1870s. He died of a stroke in October of 1881. Eli was still. The 6 surveys I've found, Nora continued, are dated 1884, 1886, 1887, 1888, and 2 from 1889. All of them expand Voss's land holdings into contested grazing territory along the Western Canyon boundaries. Contested because the original Spanish land grant documents for that area were destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1872, and the ownership has been in dispute ever since. She looked at him steadily. Combined, those 6 surveys represent just over 40,000 acres of land that Voss does not legally own. The surveys are forgeries. Someone copied Prine's signature and notarial seal from legitimate documents and applied them to fraudulent ones. The forgeries are good enough that they passed the land office's review, but they weren't good enough to fool an accountant who knew what the internal transaction ledger said and who Walter Prine was. Why does Voss need 40,000 acres he can't legitimately own? Eli said. Because he's 2 months away from being appointed Territorial Land Commissioner. She said it flatly. The appointment requires demonstrated ownership of a minimum land threshold. He needed those 40,000 acres to qualify. As commissioner, he would have authority over land grant disputes across 3 counties, including the very disputes he forged his way into. Eli sat with that for a moment. When did you confront him? 12 days ago, I thought. She stopped, pressed her lips together. I thought he would offer me money to go away quietly. I thought he was a businessman, not a... She stopped again. Her hands tightened around the cup. He had his men take me that night. The canyon. The wire. She looked at the bandana around her wrists. He expected me to be gone by morning one way or another. Dead from exposure or too broken to be believed. Did you make copies of the documents? Yes. Before I confronted him, I kept them here. Her eyes moved to the shelf of ledger books. They searched the house, Danny said without looking up from his notebook. His voice was matter-of-fact. 2 men, last night, after she didn't come home. Nora's face changed. She turned to him. Danny, I heard them come, he said. I went under the bed. He turned a page in his notebook with great calm. But I put the satchel in the wood box first, in the bottom, under the wood. The room was quiet. Eli looked at the boy. Danny reached down beside his chair where a leather document satchel sat leaning against the table leg. He lifted it onto the table and pushed it toward his aunt. She opened it with both hands and the documents were there, her careful copies in her careful handwriting, organized by date exactly as she'd left them. Nora made the same small sound she had made when she saw Danny on the front step. She put one bandaged hand flat on top of the documents and left it there. Eli watched her. Then he reached across and lifted the top sheet, a land survey dated April 1886, covering a tract of canyon land along the western boundary of the Cimarron Valley. In the signature block at the bottom, in careful flowing script, Walter Prine licensed survey and plat territory of New Mexico. He read the name twice. He turned the sheet over. Then he set it down and picked up the next one. Outside the window, the autumn light was going flat and cold the way it did in the valley, when the wind shifted north and the cottonwood leaves in the yard lifted and settled and lifted again. A rider passed slowly on the road beyond the fence. Not fast, not stopping. Just moving past the yellow door at the measured pace of a man noting a lit window and the shapes of people moving behind the glass. Nora saw it. Eli saw it. He kept his eyes on the document in his hands and turned to the next page. Danny turned a page in his notebook. On it, in careful pencil, was a horse with two riders, one large, one small, moving together through what looked like a canyon. Eli looked at the drawing for a moment. Then he went back to reading. The survey in his hands was dated 1887. The signature at the bottom was Walter Prine's. Walter Prine had been dead for 6 years by the time that signature was put on paper. Outside, the wind pressed against the yellow door with the patient persistence of something that had nowhere better to be. The rider on the road was already gone. They left before the sky got light. Eli made the decision at the kitchen table sometime past midnight, looking at the road through the window for the third time in an hour. The rider who had passed hadn't come back, which meant either he'd been satisfied with what he'd seen and reported it, or he was still out there somewhere in the dark waiting for a better moment. Neither possibility was comfortable. Either way, the yellow door on the edge of Cimarron was known now, which meant it was done. He woke Danny first gently with a hand on the boy's shoulder. Danny opened his eyes immediately, not the slow surfacing of a child from deep sleep, but the quick, full wakefulness of someone who had been sleeping lightly and waiting for a reason to stop. He sat up and reached for his boots without being asked. Eli helped him with the left one, which had a lace that didn't want to cooperate in the dark, and Danny let him without comment. Nora was already dressed when Eli came to the door of her room. She had the satchel over one shoulder and her good coat on and her hair back, and she looked at him with the specific expression of a person who had already done the arithmetic on the situation and arrived at the same answer he had. "How far?" she said. 4 miles, maybe 5. There's a hunting camp above the valley stone walls, one room. Nobody uses it after the first frost. He paused. "It's cold." "I'm aware of cold," she said, and walked past him into the front room, where Danny was waiting by the door with his notebook tucked under his arm and his coat buttoned to the top. They took the horse and went north along the river trail before cutting east up into the foothills, Eli walking the horse to keep the sound down, Nora and Danny riding. The valley below them was dark and still, the Cimarron settlement, a scatter of yellow windows against the dark. The Sangre de Cristo peaks above were black cutouts against a sky going gray at the edges. The first cold pressed down from the high country with the quiet authority of a season that had made up its mind. At the camp, Eli started a small fire in the stone hearth, hardwood low flame, the kind that gave heat without smoke you could see from a distance. While the room warmed, he laid the documents from the satchel on the floor in order of date and crouched over them with a piece of pine pitch for light, reading each one the way he used to read evidence files, slowly looking for the thread that ran through everything, the single point of origin that all the lies had grown from. Danny fell asleep on the bedroll in the corner almost immediately, his notebook still in his hand, the pencil tucked behind his ear. Nora sat against the wall with her knees drawn up and watched Eli work. After a while, she said, "You know what you're looking at. Survey fraud is land fraud. I worked 3 cases for the Pinkerton agency that touched on similar methods." He turned over a document. "Whoever did the forgeries knew what they were doing. The notarial seal is a good copy, close enough to pass a casual review. But look here." He held up the 1886 survey. "Prine's real signature has a distinctive break in the capital P. His pen ran dry at that point on every authentic document I've seen tonight. This one doesn't have the break. Whoever copied the signature copied a clean exemplar. They didn't know about the pen." Nora leaned forward. "I noticed the same thing. The break. I have 3 authenticated Prine signatures in the legitimate files, and all 3 have it. That's what made you certain. That and the fact that he died in 1881. She settled back. "But the pen break is the kind of detail that would matter to a federal examiner. The kind of detail you can't explain away." Eli set the survey down and moved to the next one. The fire ticked and the wind moved along the stone walls outside. After a while, he said, "This is about the land commissioner appointment. He's been working toward it for years. He funded the territorial governor's last 2 campaigns. He has allies in the land office. The appointment was going to be a formality." She paused. "Was. How long until the confirmation? 11 days as of this morning. The territorial legislature meets the 22nd of November to ratify it." She looked at the fire. "If the appointment goes through and he becomes commissioner, He will have the authority to adjudicate the very land disputes these surveys are part of. He will rule in his own favor. The 40,000 acres becomes permanently his, and the method of acquisition disappears into official record. Then we have 11 days. We had 11 days, she said. Tonight, the count started. Eli was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the documents laid out on the stone floor and thinking about the route from Cimarron to Santa Fe, in the state of the roads in late autumn, and the exact wording of a telegram to a federal land office inspector he hadn't spoken to in 4 years. He was also thinking about the rider who had passed the yellow door. Who else did Voss tell? He asked. Cutter Briggs would know. Briggs is his head foreman. He manages everything. The operations, the men, the things that don't go in the ledger. She said the name the way people said the names of weather systems. If Briggs knows I'm alive, he'll be looking. Eli kept his eyes on the documents. He knew Cutter Briggs. Not well, they hadn't exactly been friends, but they'd worked the same assignment out of the Denver office in the winter of 1883, a railroad bond fraud case that had required 2 weeks of parallel surveillance in a Colorado mining camp. And in those 2 weeks, Eli had learned enough about how Briggs thought to last him a lifetime. Briggs was methodical, unsentimental, and competent in the specific way that made him useful to men who needed things handled without noise. He had left the Pinkerton agency a year after Eli did for different reasons, and apparently found employment that suited his particular skill set considerably better. If Briggs was looking, he would find them. The only question was when and in what manner. Eli picked up the next document. The days at the hunting camp had a quality that neither of them had words for at the time, and both of them would remember for a long time afterward, a compressed, out-of-time quality, like the feeling inside a snow cloud when the storm hasn't quite decided to come down yet. They were careful with each other, deliberate, two people in a small space who had learned by different means to keep their own counsel, testing the distance between them, the way you tested river ice one careful step at a time. Eli worked the documents each morning. Nora watched and contributed. Her knowledge of the specific language of land, records, and survey certification was considerably deeper than his, and twice she corrected his interpretation of a filing procedure that would have led him in the wrong direction. He accepted the corrections without defensiveness, and she noticed that. Danny moved through the space between them with the easy, unconscious grace of a child who had learned to read a room the way other children read picture books. He did not demand attention. He did not ask unnecessary questions. In the mornings, he sat beside Eli at the makeshift work table and watched him read documents and drew in his notebook and occasionally held something steady when Eli needed a free hand with the quiet helpfulness of a small, skilled assistant who understood the work even if he couldn't have named it. In the evenings, he helped Nora organize the documents into the order she was building, a chronological chain of evidence. Survey by survey, date by date, the story of Harlan Voss's fraud laid out in sequence like a careful argument. On the second afternoon, Eli was checking the bootlace on Danny's left boot, the same one that hadn't wanted to cooperate in the dark on the first morning when he noticed the stitching was failing at the heel. He spent 15 minutes reinforcing it with a length of wax thread from his saddlebag. Danny watched this operation with great attention and then went back to his notebook. When he turned the page, Eli caught a glimpse of what he'd drawn: a man bent over a boot, and beside him, a boy watching. The coffee at the camp was bad. The beans were last year's, kept in a tin that had gone slightly porous, but Eli made it every morning because the act of making it was something to do with his hands while his brain worked, and because Danny liked to watch the water come to a boil with the focused fascination children brought to natural processes. He developed the habit of leaving an extra cup on the ledge above the hearth, not quite within easy reach, where Nora could take it without it being offered. She took it every morning without comment, which was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked yet. Cutter Briggs arrived on the third afternoon. He came alone, which was the first signal, and he came on foot up the last half-mile of the trail, which was the second. Both of these things meant he wanted to talk, not to push. Eli heard him on the trail 5 minutes before he appeared at the camp. His footsteps had the deliberate cadence of a man being conspicuously unhurried and had time to move Danny inside and to stand at the camp entrance with nothing particular in his hands when Briggs came around the last rock outcropping and stopped. He looked older, heavier in the jaw. His mustache had gone gray at the corners, and there was a new scar along his left cheekbone that Eli didn't recognize. But the eyes were the same pale gray, unhurried recording everything. Renaham, Briggs said. Briggs. They looked at each other with the specific neutrality of two men who had once occupied the same professional category and understood exactly what that meant about each other's capabilities. You look like you've been sleeping rough, Briggs said. I've had worse. Briggs glanced at the camp entrance. The woman and the boy inside. What do you want? Briggs reached into his coat slowly with both motions visible and produced a folded paper which he held out. Eli didn't take it immediately. Briggs unfolded it himself and held it so Eli could read it from where he stood. It was a banker's draft. The number on it had several digits. Mr. Voss's offer, Briggs said. The woman takes the boy, goes wherever she decides to go, and has enough money to stay there comfortably. The documents come back to us. Nobody pursues anyone. End of conversation. And if she declines, Briggs refolded the draft and put it back in his coat with the same deliberate unhurry. Mr. Voss would prefer not to have this conversation become complicated. He is a practical man. He's a man who left a woman tied to a fence post with wire in a canyon overnight in October, Eli said. I've met practical men. That's something else. Something moved briefly in Briggs's face, not guilt, something more complicated than that, an accountant's expression. A man adjusting the column where a certain kind of action got recorded. The offer stands until tomorrow morning, Briggs said. After that, Mr. Voss will pursue other methods of resolving the situation, and those methods will be less comfortable for everyone. He paused. You should think about the boy Crane. Whatever the woman decides about the documents, the boy has no stake in this. The boy has every stake in this, Eli said. She's all he has. Briggs regarded him for a moment. Then he turned and went back down the trail the way he had come, unhurried, his boots quiet on the frozen ground. Eli watched until he was out of sight. Then he went inside. Nora was standing against the far wall with Danny beside her, her hand on his shoulder. She had heard. Is he telling the truth, she said, about the offer? Eli thought about it honestly. Briggs always tells the truth when he delivers an offer. It's after the offer expires that he stops. She was quiet. Then he said the boy has no stake in this. He's wrong. She looked at him. How? Because Danny hid those documents, which means Briggs doesn't know the documents survived the search, which means Voss thinks he's buying back something we're holding on to out of stubbornness. He doesn't know what he's actually up against. Eli met her eyes. That's our advantage. And it only lasts until Briggs figures out why we haven't taken the money. She turned that over. How long do we have? Briggs is good. A day, maybe two, before he starts asking the right questions. He paused. We need to move tomorrow morning regardless. Danny had been sitting on the bedroll during this exchange with his notebook closed in his lap, listening with the full, undemonstrative attention he brought to everything. Now he looked up at Eli. Are you going to take us to Santa Fe? He asked. I'm going to try to get the right people to come to us, Eli said. Danny considered this. Then he opened his notebook and went back to drawing. That night, the wind came down off the high country with serious intent. For the first time, the kind of wind that was practicing for something larger, testing the joints of the stone walls and finding them acceptable. The fire was good and the room was warm, and Danny was asleep in the corner with his coat over him and his notebook still loosely held in one hand. Eli and Nora sat on opposite sides of the hearth. The documents were organized and stacked against the wall, and the empty evening stretched between them, and both of them felt the particular quality of a space that had become, in 3 days, a different kind of space than it had started out being. She told him about Danny's parents, how her brother had been the kind of man who approached every task with more love than skill, and how that combination had been his whole character, and how much she missed it. How the fever had taken him and his wife inside a week last spring, and how Danny had sat on the front step of their house for 2 days after not crying, just watching the road until Nora had come and taken him home. He stopped talking much after that, she said. Not entirely, just selectively. He decides what's worth saying. She looked at the fire. I've started to think that's not a symptom. I've started to think that's wisdom. Eli was quiet for a while. How long have you been in Cimarron? 8 years. I came for the Voss position. It was well-paying work, and I had credentials. and he needed someone who could manage the land records properly. The territory was still being carved up, and the filings were complicated. She turned her cup in her hands. I stayed because Danny needed stability after his parents died, and I was the only family he had left in the territory. She paused. I used to tell myself I would leave when things settled. But things don't settle in this territory. They just change which direction they're unsettled in. You could have run when you found the forgeries. Yes. Why didn't you? She was quiet for longer this time. The fire settled and one of the logs shifted and the room dimmed slightly and brightened again. Because I spent 6 years building those records. My name is on the authentication of every legitimate filing that office produced. My certification is attached to the valid surveys and the fraudulent ones, both because I countersigned everything that came through me. If those forgeries stand, my professional record stands with them. My name is on documents signed by a dead man, and I didn't know it, but in a court of law, that distinction requires me to prove it. She looked at him steadily. I didn't run because running looks like guilt, and I am not guilty. He looked at her across the fire. The lamplight made the angles of her face clear and exact the way lamplight did on people who had spent time outdoors in a high-altitude country, and she was looking back at him with the same direct level gaze she'd had since the first morning in the canyon, and he thought, there it is. The specific quality of a person who has decided that the truth is cheaper in the long run than any alternative. The boy draws horses, he said, the way someone draws horses when they really love them. You taught him that. Something shifted in her expression, a small, surprised opening like a window catching unexpected light. He taught himself, she said. He watched my brother's horses for hours when he was small. I just gave him the notebook. Same thing. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the fire. A silence fell between them that had a different quality than the silences. Before it warmer, more deliberate, like a blanket someone had set over the conversation without making a production of it. We should sleep, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't move. She didn't either for another moment. Then she got up and went to her bedroll and lay down with her coat over her and her face toward the wall. Eli sat by the fire a while longer, looking at the documents stacked against the wall and thinking about 11 days and dead surveyors and a land commissioner's appointment and the specific calm of a woman who had been left to die in a canyon and was still somehow not afraid of the truth. Outside, the wind pressed against the stone walls, and the first dry snow of the season began to come down in the dark, barely visible, more like a rumor than a weather event settling into the frozen grass and the bare cottonwoods without enough weight to make a sound. He rode into Cimarron before dawn. He needed to do 3 things: find Horace Webb, who had done federal documentation photography before and who owed Eli a modest favor from the previous summer, contact Inspector Aldous Keene at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, which required a telegraph, and get a sense of how the warrant situation stood. He learned the answer to the third question first. He was at the telegraph office waiting for the clerk to open when he saw Sheriff Cord Mallory come out of the land office across the street with a paper in his hand. Mallory was a square-built man in his late 40s who had been sheriff of Cimarron County for 11 years and who had in those 11 years become indistinguishable from the landscape of interests that surrounded him. He had supper at Harlan Voss's table 3 times a month. His brother-in-law ran the Voss cattle operation in the northern pastures. He was not a corrupt man. In the way that small men were corrupt, he did not take direct payments for direct favors. He was corrupt in the larger, more comfortable way, the way that felt like loyalty and common sense, and simply knowing which side of things was solid ground. Mallory posted the paper on the notice board outside the land office. He stepped back and read it once, and then went back inside. Eli walked over. The paper was a warrant. The name on it was Nora Aldridge. The charge theft of company records and proprietary documents valued in excess of $200 from the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company. The issuing authority was the county sheriff's office. The requesting party was Harlan Voss, acting as principal of the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company. Eli stood in the street outside Cord Mallory's land office and read the warrant twice and felt the specific cold that came from understanding a well-executed move. Voss had gotten there first cleanly through legitimate channels. In the eyes of the law, Nora was now the criminal. The documents she was holding were not evidence of fraud, they were stolen property. Any federal inspector who received them would receive them as the fruits of a theft. Her credibility as a witness was destroyed before she had spoken a single word in any official proceeding. He stood there in the cold street with the first snow of the season settling on his shoulders and thought it through. Then he went to find Horace Webb. The ride back to the hunting camp was 4 miles through a landscape that had gone white and quiet overnight, the first real snow of autumn coming down now in earnest, not heavily but steadily, the kind of snow that covered everything in an hour and made the world look like it had been cleaned. Eli rode it hard and tried to think harder, and by the time the camp came into view above the valley rim, he had the outline of what they needed to do. Nora was outside the camp entrance when he came up the trail standing in the snow, with her arms crossed and her face turned toward him, and he knew she had been watching for him and that she already understood from his expression that the news was not good. He told her about the warrant. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and the snow came down between them and settled on her shoulders and on the crown of her hat. "He's very good," she said. "Yes. So we don't go to the sheriff." She said it with the flatness of someone eliminating a line from a balance sheet. "We go over him." "That's what I've been thinking." "Aldous Keene?" she said. He looked at her. "Inspector Keene at the land office in Santa Fe," she said. "I know his work. He has been investigating anomalies in territorial land filings for over a year. There was a reference to a review process in a land office circular that processed 6 months ago. He is the federal oversight mechanism that Voss's political connections don't reach." She met his eyes. "You know him." "I worked a case with him in 1884. He's thorough, honest, slow, but certain." "Can you reach him?" "Telegraph today. But there's a problem, the warrant. Any documents we send to Keene are technically stolen property. He can't act on them without validating our standing to submit them. And our standing is compromised by the warrant." He paused. "Unless we photograph the documents and send the photographs before Keene knows about the warrant. Photographs are not the original documents. They're not covered by the theft charge. If the photographs reach him first and open the investigation, the warrant becomes secondary to a federal inquiry." She thought about this. "Horace Webb," she said. "You know him." "Everyone in Cimarron knows Horace. He did the photographs for the Federal Land Survey in 1887. He's careful and he's quiet." She was thinking quickly now, her eyes moving in the specific way they moved when she was working through a sequence of steps. "We need 2 sets of photographs. 2 separate couriers to Santa Fe on 2 different routes. At least one gets through." "I had the same thought. And the originals. We bring those ourselves, but not through the front door." "The newspaper." She said it with sudden certainty. "There's a territorial newspaper correspondent in Cimarron, a man named Frank Ardell. He covers land and commerce. He has been trying to get an interview with Voss for 2 years, and Voss has refused every request." She looked at Eli steadily. "If we bring the originals into the sheriff's office in front of Frank Ardell and the town judge, and whatever citizens happen to be present, we are not submitting stolen property to law enforcement. We are making public record, a public record that Ardell prints, a printed account that goes out on the stage to every territorial newspaper." Eli looked at her. "Voss can kill a warrant," she said. "He can delay a federal inquiry. He can apply political pressure to a land office inspector for weeks or months. But he cannot unprint a newspaper." She held his gaze. "The moment the story's in print, the appointment is poisoned. His political allies will distance themselves. The legislature will delay the ratification vote. That delay is all Keene needs to act." Eli was quiet for a moment. "That's very good," he said. "I've had several days to think about it," she said. The snow came down between them, steady and white and entirely indifferent, and somewhere below in the valley, a horse called and was answered by another horse. And Eli thought about 11 days in warrant paper and a dead surveyor's name on 6 documents, and the specific quality of a person who had spent a night wired to a fence post and was still standing in the first snow of autumn thinking 10 moves ahead. "We'll need 2 days to get everything ready," he said. "We have the time," she said. "Barely." She went inside. He stood in the snow a moment longer and then followed her. They spent 2 days preparing. Horace Webb came to the camp on the first day Eli had ridden down to find him before the snow got heavier, found him in his studio above the dry goods store, and had the conversation in low voices over a work table covered in chemical trays and glass plates. Webb was a thin, precise man in his 60s who had spent 40 years recording the world exactly as it appeared and who had developed through this practice a profound disinterest in things that weren't true. He looked at the survey documents Eli brought as samples, and he looked at the warrant description Eli recounted from memory, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When do you need the photographs?" "Day after tomorrow." "I'll need the documents here for 6 hours." "You'll have them." Webb made 2 full sets of photographs, every page of every document, every page of Nora's copies organized and numbered in sequence. He worked through the first night and into the following morning, and when Eli came back with Nora and Danny to collect the photographs, Webb had them wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, 2 identical packages, and he had also, without being asked, prepared an affidavit attesting to the date and circumstances of the photographic reproduction, signed and notarized with his own seal. "I did survey work for the Federal Land Office," Webb said, handing the packages to Eli. "I know what legitimate prime work looks like. The capital P on these documents is wrong." He put on his coat. "I'll testify to that if it comes to it." "It may come to it," Eli said. "Good," Webb said. He went back to his chemical trays. The couriers left on the second evening 2 young men from the valley whom Cal Drennan, a former military dispatch rider who now ran a small freight operation out of the Cimarron trading post, had recommended and vouched for. One went south through the Canyon Trail toward Mora and then southwest to Santa Fe. The other went north to Rayado before cutting west through the mountain pass. Both carried photographs. Both carried a letter from Eli addressed to Inspector Aldous Keene, Federal Land Office, Santa Fe Territory of New Mexico, requesting an immediate hold on the Voss Land Commissioner appointment pending federal review of fraudulent survey filings authenticated by a licensed photographic record now in transit. Eli had written the letter 4 times before he was satisfied with it. The language had to be precise enough to compel action and formal enough to be taken seriously, and it had to establish Eli's standing to make the request, which he did, by citing his former Pinkerton service, his personal familiarity with Keene from the 1884 case, and most importantly, the professional standing of Nora Aldridge as a licensed land records administrator whose formal authentication of the survey chain was itself a matter of public record. Nora read the letter when he was done. She read it twice. Then she said, "You listed my certification before your Pinkerton history. Your certification is more relevant to a federal land examiner than my employment history." She folded the letter and handed it back to him. She looked like she was going to say something else, and then didn't. Danny had been sitting by the hearth watching the letter-writing process with the focused attention he brought to anything Eli did, and when the letter was sealed, he appeared at Eli's elbow with his notebook open to a fresh page. "Can I see?" Danny said. Eli showed him the sealed envelope. Danny studied the address written on the outside for a moment. Then he drew a picture of an envelope with 2 horses beside it. They came down from the foothills on the morning of the 3rd day, the snow on the ground now consolidated into a hard, pale crust that crackled under the horses' hooves, the sky above the valley, blue and cold and very clear. Nora rode behind Eli with the original documents in the satchel under her coat pressed against her chest. Danny rode in front of Eli with his notebook in his lap and his coat buttoned to the throat. They were 4 miles outside Cimarron when Cutter Briggs came out of the tree line. He was not alone this time. 3 men behind him fanned out across the trail, positioned with the practical efficiency of men who knew their job. Briggs himself sat in the center of the trail on a bay horse, unhurried, watching them come. Eli pulled up. They stopped. The morning was very quiet, the silence of a snow-covered landscape before the wind comes up, absolute and clean, the kind of quiet that made voices carry farther than they should. Briggs looked at Eli. He looked at Nora. He looked at Danny. "End of the road, Crane," he said. "The offer expired yesterday morning." "I remember." "Then you know what this is." Briggs's hand moved toward his coat. 2 of the men behind him straightened in their saddles. The 3rd moved his horse a half step to the right, angling toward Nora. Nobody spoke. Then Danny said, "My pa said men like you need people to be scared of you." Briggs's hand stopped. Danny was looking at him with the direct, unbothered gaze of a 9-year-old who had sat on a cold front step all night and decided somewhere in that darkness what things were worth being afraid of and what things were not. His voice was conversational. He held his notebook in both hands, and he was not afraid. "I'm not scared of you," Danny said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before. Briggs looked at the boy for a long moment. Something moved in his face, a small, unguarded thing gone quickly, the kind of expression a man got when he was reminded unexpectedly of something he used to know about himself. Eli reached into his coat, slowly, with both motions visible, the way Briggs had reached for the banker's draft 2 days ago. He produced an envelope and held it out. Briggs looked at it. "Take it," Eli said. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle and took the envelope. He turned it over. His name was on it, not a title or a company, just Cutter Briggs in Eli's handwriting. "Inside that envelope," Eli said, "is a precise account of your involvement in 3 separate fraud cases handled by the Denver Pinkerton office between 1881 and 1884. Specifically, your role in the destruction of survey evidence in the Colfax County Railroad case, the disappearance of 2 witnesses in the Trinidad bond case, and the irregular handling of the Colorado Springs mining claim filings that resulted in the conviction of a man named Henry Sears." He kept his voice even and quiet. "Copies of that account have already been posted to 3 federal offices: the U.S. Marshal's Office in Denver, the Territorial Attorney General in Santa Fe, and Inspector Aldous Keene at the Federal Land Office." He paused. "Those copies are already in transit. I sent them with the photographs yesterday. You can't stop them." Briggs held the envelope. "You can take us in," Eli said, "and you will be arrested alongside Voss within the month. Or you can move off this trail, and the only name on those charges is his." He let that sit for a moment. "I spent 4 years trying to decide whether destroying evidence made me the same kind of man as the people who ordered it. I've decided it doesn't, but I've also decided I won't do it again." He looked at Briggs directly. "Step aside, Cutter." The wind came off the mountains, then a cold, clean gust that moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek below and lifted a small cloud of snow crystals off the ground and let them fall again. Briggs sat on his horse with the envelope in his hand for a very long time. Then he moved his horse off the trail. The 3 men behind him looked at each other. One of them looked at Briggs. Briggs was looking at the mountains. After a moment, all 3 of them moved their horses off the trail. Eli touched his heels to his horse's sides, and they moved forward through the gap and on toward Cimarron. He didn't look back. Neither did Nora. Danny turned his head once to look and then faced forward again and opened his notebook and began to draw. Frank Ardell was in the Cimarron Telegraph office when Eli found him writing up a dispatch about the County Water Rights Commission, which Ardell himself acknowledged was perhaps the least compelling story he had covered in 3 years. He was a thin, energetic man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers and the specific, sharpened attentiveness of a person who had spent years believing that the truth properly told was the most useful thing in the world. When Eli set a copy of the warrant on the desk beside him and said, "Harlan Voss land fraud, 40,000, forged acres, dead surveyor, 11-day window," Ardell put down his pen and gave him the full attention of a man who had just been handed something considerably more interesting than water rights. Eli talked for 20 minutes. Ardell listened and took notes and asked 3 precise questions and then said, "When?" "This afternoon, 2 o'clock, Sheriff's Office. She's coming in to read from the original ledger in front of witnesses." "I'll be there," Ardell paused. "I'll also need the judge." "I've already spoken to Judge Harker." Ardell looked at him. "You've been busy." "She has," Eli said. "I'm just the man who followed a horse." Judge Abram Harker was 71 years old and had been on the Cimarron bench since the territory was a different shape. He was not a bold man, and he was not a political man. He was a careful, precise, unhurried man who believed that the law meant what it said when you could read it without squinting, and that when it required squinting, you should probably read it again. He had no particular love for Harlan Voss and no particular grudge against him either. He had, however, a professional interest in the integrity of land title records that had been formed over 40 years of watching what happened to communities when those records failed. When Eli came to his office at noon with a summary of the evidence and a request for his presence at 2 o'clock, Harker read the summary and asked 2 questions and then said, "I will be there. This is not a judicial proceeding. I am attending as a witness and as a member of this community. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good." He folded the summary and set it on his desk. Is the woman prepared? Yes, sir. Harker looked at him over the rims of his reading glasses. Are you, Eli thought about that honestly. I'll do, he said. Harker made a sound that might have been approval. They gathered in the sheriff's office at 2 o'clock in the thin, cold afternoon light. Cord Mallory had not been informed in advance, which was deliberate. He was behind his desk when Nora walked in with Eli behind her and Danny at her side, and his expression went through 3 phases in about 2 seconds: recognition, calculation, and the specific, uncomfortable look of a man who understands that the situation has moved past the point where his preferred option is still available. Behind them came Judge Harker, who nodded to Mallory with judicial neutrality and took a position against the wall. Behind Harker came Frank Ardell with his notebook and 2 Cimarron merchants brothers named Tory, who owned the dry goods store and the feed barn respectively, who had been quietly invited by Eli that morning on the grounds that a community matter of this nature deserved community witnesses. The Tory brothers came because they were the kind of men who showed up when asked, and because they had both had dealings with Harlan Voss's land operations over the years that had left them with more questions than answers. There were 8 people in the room. Mallory looked at Nora. Miss Aldridge, you are aware there is an active warrant. I am aware, Nora said. Her voice was completely steady. She had the satchel on the table in front of her, and her hands were flat on the leather, and she looked at Mallory without hostility and without fear, and with the specific calm of a person who had made peace with the worst possible outcome and found it survivable. She opened the satchel. She set the ledger on the table. It was a large cloth-bound volume, heavy. Its spine creased from years of regular use. The cover read Cimarron Land and Cattle Company, Internal Transaction, Record Volume 4, in Nora's own handwriting. She opened it to a page marked with a slip of paper. This is the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company Internal Transaction Ledger, she said loud enough for the room. I maintained this record in my capacity as licensed land records administrator for the company for 6 years. Every entry in this ledger was recorded contemporaneously with the corresponding transaction and countersigned by me in my professional capacity. She turned the ledger so the page faced the room. The entry dated March 14th, 1886. Records the submission of a land survey to the Territorial Land Office covering the Western Canyon Boundary Tract recorded under filing reference number 1886-NM-847. The survey was submitted under the certified signature of Walter Prine, licensed surveyor. She paused. The internal transaction notation on this entry reads, survey documents prepared per VH instruction signature secured from archived exemplar, Prine deceased. The notation is in Harlan Voss's handwriting. I have 6 years of authenticated samples of his handwriting in the files I maintain. This notation is his. The room was very quiet. Ardell's pen moved. Nora closed the ledger. I have 6 additional entries of the same type across this volume, she said. Each one documents the fraudulent filing of a land survey under a dead man's certification. The combined acreage of those filings is 43,217 acres of contested canyon and grazing land in the Cimarron Valley. That land was fraudulently claimed by Harlan Voss over a period of 4 years in order to meet the ownership threshold required for appointment as Territorial Land Commissioner. She looked at Mallory. The warrant on file against me charges theft of company records. These records have not been stolen. They were maintained by me in my professional capacity. My legal standing to produce them as evidence of a crime is a matter of certified record at the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. She placed one hand flat on the ledger. I am not the criminal in this room. She looked at Judge Harker. Harker was looking at the ledger on the table. His expression was the expression of a man reading something very carefully for the second time. He looked up at Mallory. Sheriff, he said in the tone of a man stating a clear and uncomplicated fact. I believe you have a matter to investigate. Mallory looked at the ledger. He looked at Ardell writing. He looked at the Tory brothers, both of whom were looking at the ledger with the focused attention of men making decisions about what they believed. He looked at Nora. He reached across his desk and he picked up the warrant paper. He held it for a moment, then he set it face down on the desk. I will need to review the evidence formally, he said. Miss Aldridge, you are not being detained. This office will... He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words. This office will be in contact with the Territorial land office regarding the matters raised this afternoon. It was not an arrest. It was not an exoneration. It was the sound of a man choosing under pressure to step off the track before the train came through. It was enough. Ardell stopped writing, looked at his notes, and started writing again faster. They were outside in the cold afternoon light when Harlan Voss arrived. He came on foot alone, which nobody had expected. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders with white hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working outside and had the authority of it in his bearing. He stopped on the boardwalk outside the sheriff's office when he saw Nora and Eli and Danny and the small crowd that had followed them out. He looked at Nora for a long moment. His face was not the face of the man Nora had expected. Not red, not furious, not calculating. He looked, she thought, like a man standing in front of something large that he had been moving toward for a very long time and had just reached. "I built all of it," he said. He said it to her specifically, not to the crowd, not to Eli Crane. He said it the way a person said a thing they had been turning over in their mind for days and had finally decided to say out loud. Nora looked at him. She thought about 6 years in his employ. She thought about the canyon. She thought about Danny on the front step. She thought about what a man could be starting from nothing and what it wanted. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters what you did with it." He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he looked at the ground. Then he turned and walked back in the direction he had come. Nobody stopped him. He would be found and arrested before the week was out when Keene's investigation got fully underway and the warrant arrived from Santa Fe. But in that moment in the cold afternoon, he simply walked away, and something in the watching had the quality of a door closing on a room that everyone knew, but that nobody would enter again. The telegraph from Santa Fe arrived on the 4th day. Eli was at the camp. They had stayed there another day after the sheriff's office, waiting to see how the wind moved, when Cal Drennan rode up the hill with it folded inside his jacket. He handed it to Eli without ceremony and waited. Eli read it. Then he read it again. He handed it to Nora. The message was from Inspector Aldous Keene, Federal Land Office, Santa Fe. It was 8 lines. It informed them that the photographic documentation received via courier had been reviewed and found sufficient to initiate a federal inquiry under the Territorial Land Fraud Act of 1878. The Land Commissioner appointment of Harlan Voss had been formally suspended pending investigation. An order had been issued for the preservation of all relevant records at the Cimarron Land and Cattle Company. A federal examiner would arrive in Cimarron within 10 days. The last line said, "Your standing in this matter is formally recognized. A. Keene." Nora read it twice. Then she set it on the table and put both hands flat on the surface and stood there for a moment with her head down and her eyes closed. Not crying, just holding still. Danny came and stood beside her and put his hand on her arm. Cal Drennan looked at Eli. Eli gave him a small nod. Drennan touched his hat and rode back down the hill. The federal examiner arrived on the 8th day and found a case that had already organized itself. Nora's evidence chain was complete and annotated. Webb's photographic record was authenticated and indexed. Ardell's published account in the territorial newspaper had already been reprinted in 3 other territorial papers, and Judge Harker had prepared a formal affidavit describing the proceedings at the sheriff's office in clinical and entirely convincing detail. Voss was arrested on the 10th day. The charge was federal land fraud. His bail was set at a sum that suggested the territory was not planning to let him wander far. His political allies, one by one, put out the specific kind of public statement that politicians put out when they are distancing themselves from something they were never actually associated with and certainly never supported. The land commissioner appointment was formally withdrawn on the 11th day, one day before the scheduled confirmation vote. Briggs was not arrested immediately, though the file Eli had sent to the federal offices was formally received and acknowledged. He left the territory sometime in the 3rd week of November, headed as far as anyone could determine the north. The warrant was pending. Whether it would ever catch him was a question for the marshals. Eli had done what he could and had decided that was enough. 3 weeks after the day they had ridden down from the hills through the first snow, Eli was still in Cimarron. He told himself it was because the roads were bad, which was true. The first real snow of the season had come down in the 2nd week of November and had not gone back up, and the pass to the south was running slow with mud and ice. It was a reasonable explanation, and he had been using it every morning when he woke up in the small room above Cal Drennan's freight office and looked at the ceiling and asked himself what he was still doing here. He had developed a routine, morning coffee at the table in Nora's kitchen, which had become his table too, in the specific unacknowledged way that things became yours when nobody objected to your presence long enough. Then work there was always at work, the kind that accumulated in a town that was still being built, fence repair and winter wood, and the 100 small structural questions that arose when a freeze set in hard. Danny came with him, sometimes on the smaller jobs, watching with the focused notebook, attention he brought to everything, drawing in his notebook during any pause in the work, drawing the finished results with the same care he brought to the process. In the evenings, they ate at the kitchen table and talked about things that were not the fraud case and not the appointment and not Voss or Briggs or the federal examiner. They talked about books Nora had read and a horse Eli had owned once in Colorado and what Danny thought snow tasted like. He had conducted scientific research on this question and was prepared to share his findings in the names of the mountains visible from the south window and whether those names were accurate descriptions of the mountains or just stories someone had told about them. Eli did not reach for his coat when the evenings ended. He just sat at the table and listened to the fire and the wind and the sounds of a household settling into its own particular quiet. He knew what it was. He had known for longer than he wanted to admit, probably since the second morning at the hunting camp, when she had corrected his reading of a survey filing without apology and gone directly back to work. He was a man who had spent 4 years practicing not belonging anywhere, and he had turned out to be considerably worse at it than he'd supposed. On the morning of the 22nd of November, a month to the day from when the federal examiner had arrived, Eli came down from Cal Drennan's freight office to find Danny on the front step of the yellow-doored house. The boy was sitting straight-backed in the cold morning, with his notebook on his lap and his pencil working and his dark eyes moving between the page and the road with the focused calm of a craftsman at work. The snow in the yard had gone hard and blue-white in the early light, and the cottonwoods along the road had lost every leaf and stood spare and clear against the pale sky. Eli stopped at the gate. "Cold to be sitting outside," he said. "I wanted to see the light," Danny said without looking up. Eli opened the gate and came up the path and stopped beside the step. Danny held up the notebook. On the page was a drawing, careful, precise, the best thing the boy had made in weeks. Two riders on a horse moving through what was clearly the canyon country, east of town, the canyon walls rough sketched with cross-hatching, the horse in motion, both riders facing forward. The smaller figure in front, the larger behind. The larger figure's arm was around the smaller one, holding him steady in the saddle. Eli looked at it for a long time. "That's a good drawing," he said. "I know," Danny said. He closed the notebook. The door of the house opened and Ara came out with 2 cups of coffee, the good strong kind, that stripped paint, and handed one to Eli and stood on the step and looked at the road and the pale sky and the bare cottonwoods and the hard blue snow in the yard. They stood there for a while without speaking. The morning was very clear and very cold and very still. "The examiner filed his final report yesterday," she said. "Keene wrote to say the case is solid. The trial will be in the spring." "I know. Ardell told me. You'll need to testify." "I know that too." She turned the cup in her hands. "The spring is a long way off," she said. "It is." Another silence. Danny had opened his notebook again and was adding small details to the canyon walls in his drawing, a bird on a ledge, a line of shadow. "The roads to the south will be clear by January," Eli said. Nora looked at the mountains. "Probably," she said. He looked at the side of her face. She was looking at the mountains with the level, steady gaze she brought to everything, the gaze of a woman who had spent 6 years keeping exact records and 2 weeks surviving something that should have broken her and had not, and who was standing now in the morning light of a late autumn day with her coffee getting cold in her hands and her nephew drawing beside her on the front step of a house with a yellow door. "Nora," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. All the things he might have said, the careful things, the qualified things, the sensible accountings of where he had been and what he owed and what a man with his history was and wasn't entitled to, were present and available as they always were, and he set them aside. "Stay," she said. She said it first. She said it quietly without performance, in the specific tone of a woman who had decided that some things cost more than they needed to and that this was not one of them. Eli looked at her. He looked at Danny on the step with his notebook, who was drawing something new. Now a house with a yellow door, and in the yard, two figures standing close together in the snow. He looked at the mountains and the pale sky and the hard blue morning. He took his coat off the gatepost where he'd hung it when he came through, and he hung it back up. The single cottonwood at the edge of the yard had held 3 leaves through all of it, through the first frost, in the early snows, and the long cold weeks of the investigation, and the arrest, and the examiner, and the testimony, and all of it. 3 leaves dry and gold and stubborn, turning slowly in the morning wind. On the morning Eli hung his coat back up, the last leaf let go. It fell without drama, spinning once in the cold air, and landed in the blue-white snow at the base of the tree and lay there still. Danny looked up from his notebook and watched it fall. Then he looked at Eli, then at Nora. Then he turned a page to a fresh sheet and picked up his pencil. Stay. The word moved between them like a leaf in still air, small, unhurried, already arrived. This story was entirely fictional and created for entertainment only. If it moved something in you, if you felt the cold of that canyon or the warmth of that kitchen tap, like and subscribe so you never miss the next ride. Pour your coffee, your tea, whatever keeps you company on a long evening, and tell me in the comments, what time is it, where you are, and what city are you listening from? Because your story matters too.